Good afternoon. It looks like we've got a few folks filtering in here, so we'll just give it another moment for the Zoom to populate. But I want to say thanks to those who are joining us today for our conversation on the war in Ukraine after 2 years. And I would like to, before handing over the floor to Joshua to get into the conversation, to thank Joshua Huminski for organizing a series of discussions, including this one today, on important topics. I think all of us wish that by now we wouldn't be discussing the war in Ukraine and that had been resolved favorably, but clearly this is going to be a topic of focus for some time. And the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress has been part of the conversation looking at various aspects of this conflict, everything from tactical lessons learned from the actual warfighting to lessons that great powers either are or should be taking from this conflict. And today, I think we're going to focus more on the tactical situation and what's happening on the ground. But I can't thank enough our panelists, General David Barno, Dr. Nora Ben-Sahel, and Michael Kaufman for coming back again. I want to thank you all for your tremendously valuable analysis on what's happening and what we're learning on the ground in Ukraine, and also for agreeing to share your time with us and our audience. In terms of helping us promulgate those lessons to others. So we really appreciate you being here. I feel like this is one of those discussions where we're going to fill the whole time and more, and could easily go over. So why don't I go ahead and stop doing the intro and turn it over to Joshua, and let's get right into the conversation. Joshua, over to you.
Thank you very much, Representative Nye. I'm very pleased to be reconvening this panel for what is at least the third time, quite possibly the fourth time, of such distinguished speakers as General Barno, Dr. Ben-Sahel, and Mr. Kaufman, who is now, correct me if I'm wrong, with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So congratulations on your new appointment there. We're a few days away from the official second anniversary of the opening of the invasion of the war against Ukraine, and it is a very apt time to reflect on some significant changes that has happened over these 2 years, but also look towards the future such as we can. Certainly, we cannot make any predictions about the future because it is very contingent on a number of different variables and factors, if I may steal a phrase from Mr. Kaufman. I actually do want to start with you, if I may, Mr. Kaufman, just to give us a snapshot of where we are at a very macro level 2 years after the war has begun. We just saw the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Vitka, and we'd just love to get your thoughts on kind of where we stand today.
Sure. Thanks, Josh, and good to be back with everybody again for another panel discussion. So maybe broad overview. I think that Ukraine enters 2024 in a rather difficult position compared to last year. Russia holds the material advantages right now in this war, at least for 2024, along with much of the initiative along the front line, with the exception of the Black Sea, where Ukraine had been fairly successful last year. Ukraine is dealing right now with a compound problem of a deficit in artillery ammunition and the lack of manpower, particularly infantry. The resources do not appear to be available for another major Ukrainian offensive this year. So this year it looks like it's going to be focused much more on holding a defensive line, rebuilding, reconstituting, and maybe expanding a strike campaign against Russian forces. Ukrainian strategy right now is being self-described as active defense, although there's some debate as to what that means and what it's going to end up being, since Ukraine now has a new military leadership, and that military leadership has to figure out how they're going to address these challenges. It seems to be prioritizing consolidation and entrenchment, trying to rationalize the force, and working to reconstitute its combat potential. Now, Western material support, which is, as you know, being debated in Congress here in DC, is essential to providing the much-needed artillery ammunition, equipment, and replenishment that Ukrainian forces are going to need, along with training, while Ukraine itself has to make some very difficult political choices this year on mobilization in order to replenish the force and to generate additional formations so they can rotate exhausted units off the line. Russia has also struggled to convert its relative advantage into a decisive one, despite having a 5-to-1 advantage in fires, more manpower, and more equipment than Ukraine. It has not been able to achieve decisive breakthroughs, and it still seems very constrained in terms of the quality of the force. That's to be expected. In a conventional war, it's much easier to replace the numbers than it is to replace the quality of personnel, junior leadership, and your ability to use that force at scale, right, to conduct more complex types of operations on a larger scale. The battle over Avdiivka, which has been running since the Russian attack there back on October 10th of last year, reflects the challenges that both sides face. On the one hand, Ukrainian forces, outnumbered and outgunned, were steadily being attrited and were forced to retreat after fighting a defensive battle. But they forced the Russian military to pay a very steep price for those gains. The Russian armed forces lost an entire army's worth of equipment after 5 months worth of fighting in order to take the salient in Avdiivka. And equipment is probably Russia's greatest limiting factor today if we look amongst manpower, artillery, ammunition, and ability to replace equipment at a sufficient rate. So it shows both the advantage that Russia holds to some extent, but that the relative advantages they enjoy are not necessarily going to be decisive. Much hangs in the balances here. A lot depends on external support that Ukraine can expect, but first and foremost on the decisions that Ukrainian political and military leaders make themselves at this point.
Thank you very much for that overview. And General Barno, if I can turn to you and rewind the clock back a little bit and looking at the late summer, early autumn, winter expectations for the counteroffensive success. There was a great deal of conversation, certainly amongst the policy community, but especially in the social media sphere, about expectations for what that offensive would look like and what it could achieve. I'm curious if you could talk to what the expectations were and how they did not necessarily materialize or manifest on the battlefield to lead us to where the situation that Mr. Kaufman described.
Yeah, I think without getting into too much of the tactical detail, I'd say that, there was a widespread anticipation and there was a tremendous amount of international NATO U.S. support to build the Ukrainian force to launch this counteroffensive last summer and into the fall, with a great deal of promise being associated with that frankly did not materialize as we now look at it 6 months later. And the expectations were probably above what they should have been for the force at that time. I also think they may have reflected a misrepresentation of what changes the Russians had made inside of their own structures to be able to absorb a Ukrainian offensive, knowing that it was coming. It was pretty clear that that was going to happen. And we can talk a bit about Russian adaptations and how they have really learned a great deal in the 2 years of this war, arguably, some would say, more than the Ukrainians have, and adapted more than the Ukrainians have, certainly in the last year. And then the Ukrainians using actually an interesting combination of NATO military doctrine, U.S. NATO military doctrine, and also obviously now being heavily equipped with a Western type of military with armored vehicles, the same doctrine to be used for that. So in a sense, the Ukrainians went into this conflict employing Western doctrine with Western training with some new Western equipment and didn't succeed. And that should be very sobering to the U.S. military and other NATO militaries out there, because we thought collectively we had a pretty good picture on what the Russians could do, how they would defend, what their vulnerabilities were. And we worked for months to prepare the Ukrainians to crack that open and to be able to regain a tremendous amount of territory, to achieve a breakthrough through the Russian defenses. And that fell flat on its face, frankly. And there's a lot of retrospective thinking that needs to be done about what caused that.
Dr. Ben-Sahel, on that specifically, could you talk to the friction that we seem to have seen from the application of a Western-style maneuver doctrine to what is a post-Soviet, sort of very mass-heavy military force, and lessons from the past when we look at that friction of two competing doctrines? I mean, I have your wonderful book here. I don't know if it's going to pop up on the screen, Adaptation Under Fire, which is excellent, and I highly recommend it to everybody. But one of the key things that both you and General Barno focus on is the evolution of doctrine and how it shapes adaptation. So was it fundamentally a mismatch from the beginning that led to overexuberant expectations? Was it doomed to fail? Or what lessons from the past do you have on that?
No, I wouldn't say it was doomed to fail, but I do think that the United States has made some of the same mistakes in the training effort that it has made in previous training efforts, during past wars, as recently as Afghanistan and Iraq, is that the United States military tends to train others in our own image. And when you're putting that on top of a country that's just rebuilding its military forces from scratch in some cases, Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to completely redo how those militaries fought, coming out of Taliban rule in Afghanistan and, of course, Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq. Up to, if you go back in history, building other forces in our own image is something that the United States does in most of its wars. And I think some of that has hampered the training effort as well. And Michael has written a terrific article that goes into a lot of the recent problems that Ukraine has had, and the Western training apparatus not being exactly what the Ukrainians need, needing to switch now to a focus on unit training rather than individual training, so that units and their larger unit staffs can fight better. I think all of those things are part of the challenges that Ukraine has been undergoing. But if I were to zoom back for a moment, I would say that I don't think 2 years ago, or even a year ago, even if we had said that the war would be continuing on, a stalemate is better than some of the outcomes that might have otherwise happened, right? I mean, there are plenty of points in this war where, but for a couple of decisions, things could have easily swung the other way, and this could have been over in Russia's favor by now. So the fact that the Ukrainians are still fighting, they have very considerable problems, as Michael just outlined. But I don't think any of the Western assistance efforts and anything that the Ukrainians have done themselves have necessarily been doomed to fail at all. I think there has been a lot of adaptability in the Ukrainian military. I would say over the 2-year period, the Ukrainian military has been the most adaptable overall. If you look at the past year, maybe more the Russians, but over the full 2 years, the Ukrainians have come a tremendous way, and I think that's worth noting.
Mr. Kaufman, building off of that, if I may ask, one of the interesting things, you had a piece in Survival magazine, if I'm not mistaken, that just came out recently about the need to focus on attrition in terms of the doctrinal approach for the Ukrainian military, mass destructive fires as opposed to maneuver and precision. How are you seeing that implemented on the ground, and where is there potential friction points within the Western approach, maneuver dominant, the industrial base to support that sort of warfare versus what the Ukrainians need and are acting right now?
Okay, thanks, Josh. So let me try to describe this in a way that's going to be interesting for somebody other than an Army major, which is usually the one camp of people that are most fascinated in the maneuver as doctrinal debates. So first, the thrust of the article wasn't describing attrition as a strategy or as a form of warfare. It's a characteristic that's innate to warfare, no matter what form of warfare you're pursuing. It was discussing it as a key aspect of sort of a destruction-oriented approach, right? And that the Ukrainian military, in terms of force structure and how it operates, is to some extent a successor of the Soviet military, and it is a military that's heavily driven by land-based fires and by the decisive use of artillery firepower in order to degrade an opposing force, and then exploit that, right? Rather than just using fires to enable combined arms maneuver. And the force was originally structured much more as a defensive military that is much more able to conduct a mobile defense or defense in depth than being able to scale offensive action. One of the big challenges the United States faced in planning for the offensive, which I agree with Nora, it was not doomed to fail. I'm not sure it was incredibly likely to succeed, at least the maximal aims of it, but there was definitely a shot that they could have achieved their minimal aims of breaking through the defensive line to get at least to Tokmak. But the challenge was that the U.S. did not understand the force we were training and how they fight, which is not a first, okay, to be perfectly frank. And we undervalued the challenge that a well-prepared defense would pose. And we overconsumed the lessons of Russia's defeat in Kharkiv, where they had a substantial deficit of manpower without prepared lines, from which the Russian military learned, heavily entrenched and fortified, refilled their formations with mobilized manpower, and the challenge was very different and much greater last summer and fall. Now, when it comes to your question on the maneuver school of thought, here I think the best way to think about it is that, from my point of view, the shock and suppression and the decisive advantage is brought by an advantage in fires. Okay, in the maneuverist approach, where shock and cognitive effects were meant to be derived from the actual combined arms assault and initial breaching operation that was meant to crash into the Russian lines, this did not deliver. The breaching effort failed. And I can briefly describe the 3 reasons why. The first is that Ukraine did not have an advantage in fires over the Russian military, even though it was the one conducting the offensive operation. Even at its highest point during the offensive, the Ukrainian advantage of fires was almost 2-to-1, which is relative parity in practice. Okay, this is problem 1. Problem 2, the Ukrainian military really struggles to scale offensive action. What that means is that for brigades to conduct maneuver, they're mostly doing it at the level of a reinforced company and maybe a couple companies per brigade at any given time. This is a scale at which they can coordinate, so it's very difficult for them to mass, right? Which means if they have an advantage, even if they're able to attain a breach, it's very difficult for them to exploit, right, and then sustain momentum at that rate, if that's the sort of largest force packet that they can put together in the battlefield. And third, there was a deficit of enablers in order to get to a defense organized in that fashion, from mine-breaching equipment to short-range air defense, just to deal with the basic challenge of Russian combat helicopters that were just picking up any armored columns that were going to break through. So all three of these combined to make it very, very difficult early on. Then Ukraine adjusted tactics, switching to dismounted infantry assault, right, in smaller scale units, usually at the platoon level or below, and attaining a fire superiority, which they worked hard at and established over the course of July and August. It wasn't sufficient, but it allowed them to essentially fight the offensive to a tactical draw. They were not able to achieve their objectives, but if you look at the overall loss rate between the attacking force and the defending force, particularly in the main effort in the south, it was probably relatively close, which is at least saying something, because usually the side that's attacking is expected to suffer much greater casualties over the entrenched side that is defended. Anyway, the thrust of the article is that the Western school of thought, at least speaking here from the United States, is always enamored with maneuver, believes maneuver warfare is better, and thinks that attrition is somehow slower or inadequate, or is an approach that's meant to be avoided, right? And because of that, is not really appreciative that this is actually played to Ukraine's advantages. This is how Ukrainian forces are likely to fight, and without inflicting significant levels of attrition and attaining this fire's advantage against a well-prepared defense, it is very hard to advance, because a maneuver assault is not going to have those cognitive effects on the opponent. I hope I explained this in a way that makes sense. It's the sort of thing that might make sense in my head, and I can never tell if I explained it in a way that any other rational person is able to understand.
Absolutely. It was incredibly succinct and very clear, certainly from my perspective. I want to build off of that.
Can I jump in for a second?
Absolutely.
I understood that perfectly. Let me take it up a level or two to the operational or high strategic level as well. One of the things that we've said 3 or 4 of our conversations since the beginning of the war is that the changing character of war has favored the defensive in this war ever since the beginning. And at the beginning, the Ukrainians were on the defensive, right? That's natural when you're being attacked. And so Ukraine did have a lot of advantages, especially as it started fielding swarms of drones, was getting open source intelligence on where Russian forces were. The transparency of the battlefield really helps the defense. And that was a Ukrainian advantage for certainly the first part of the war. I don't want to put an exact date on it, but the first part of the war. What happened over the past year is once it got stalemated, the Russians dug in, and they really dug in. And so they started getting some of the advantages of being a defender, and Ukraine had some disadvantages because it wasn't just defending anymore. It was needing to counterattack in order to take territory. Michael, I was smiling before when you said nobody really knows what active defense means. I suspect part of the reason that you talk about, the Ukrainians are talking about active defense, is it sure sounds a lot better for your domestic populace to talk about active defense, suggesting you're still doing things, than just sitting there on defense. But I think that's one of the dynamics in this war that has changed, is that Russia has at times, of course, it's still an attacker, it's still on the offense in places, but because of the stalemate, it's gotten some of the advantages of being a defender. And that has changed for all of the tactical reasons that Michael explained very well. I think that's one of the issues that Ukraine has been struggling with, frankly, the neutering of an advantage it had more of at the beginning of the war.
General Barno, if I could turn to you, building off of what Mr. Kaufman and Dr. Ben-Sahel have just discussed, how have you seen in practice the tactical lessons, the operational experience translated into changes in doctrine, and how would you envision certainly Western support and backers in terms of the training adapting to this new dynamic and the predominance of the defensive here and what active defense will look like in the future? So how are these institutions going to learn? How have they adapted, and how do they need to adapt going forward to be prepared for what 2024 brings?
I think that's very much still a work in progress. And I think part of this is looking at the strategic picture in trying to understand what is the theory of victory here? What is going to allow the Ukrainians to succeed, given where we are today, and what both Michael and Dr. Bensel have described is essentially we moved from the first year of being open warfare, particularly in the first 6 or 8 months, to now fixed or positional warfare. This in many ways does begin to look like the middle years of World War I, where both sides have just deeply dug in. The gains are incremental. There's no huge breakthroughs. There's an inability to exploit any attacks that are successful. Your gains are in thousands of yards or less, not in miles and kilometers. And so that's the situation on the battlefield. And it's very difficult to return to open warfare once you get both sides entrenched, literally and figuratively, on long lines that stretch hundreds of kilometers across the country, which is where we are today. So it also begs the question of how does either side succeed given this? This has reduced the likelihood of a dramatic breakthrough, a D-Day invasion type of cracking of the West Wall, and one side overwhelming the other. But it has put us in a situation of perhaps some long-term attritional grinding warfare that we're seeing versions of in the last 6 months. So what does that mean for doctrine and how NATO advises the Ukrainians and how the Russians absorb some of these lessons as well? I think both sides have continued to adjust their doctrine. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the Russians have probably adjusted theirs more rapidly in this last year to take advantage of what they were able to produce in their industrial base. They now have a centralized lessons learned body that actually accumulates what they're seeing on the battlefield. And as several authors have noted, they can actually turn that into policy changes and impact their defense industrial base and move in the direction of these changes systematically far more adroitly than the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians are very good at bottom-up adaptation. The Russians are slower at bottom up, but they're top down in their systems wide ability to adapt gives them some major long-term advantages in this type of fight. So what's that mean for the Ukrainians? I think, as I noted earlier, NATO, as it advises the Ukrainian military, has to step back and say what succeeded and what failed in the counteroffensive last fall. What did we learn about what's not going to work with NATO doctrine? How do you conduct a force breach of fortified lines? The traditional ways that the West has done that, or the United States has done that, isn't going to work in the situation we have right now because the Russians have adapted their defensive measures to be able to make that virtually impossible. And on the Russian side, I think they're going to have to think about, they're still interested in achieving territorial gains, but I think they've got the wherewithal now. The advantages very much tilt to the larger country with the larger population and the larger military when you're in an enduring war of attrition. And that's going to make it very difficult for either side to see some, major gains here this year. So doctrine is going to shift, mostly thinking about the tactical level, but I don't see a doctrinal breakthrough that will allow any kind of significant battlefield victory for either side here looking in the immediate future.
Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, sure. Great comments, I think, by David. Nora, I think that that's very much correct. Ukraine has historically been better at innovation and adaptation, but not good at scaling those solutions. A large-scale conventional war very much comes down to being able to scale your solutions onto the battlefield. And in Ukraine, historically, civil society has filled the gap of a lack of state capacity. Russia is much better at top-down adaptation because Russia has greater state capacity and overall state control and command of the economy and is able to mobilize those resources in the contest, okay? All right, that said, I also want to say that you have the initial period of war, right, where you typically have high-intensity maneuver warfare. A lot of things are subject to chance, to human agency, to contingency, right? But as you get into the long war and the prolonged conventional conflict, that's where I feel the strategic factors have a much greater say. They cast a bigger shadow over the arc and the course of the war. Then it becomes much more about who has the greatest latent potential in manpower, as Dave said, in industrial capacity. More importantly, who can better mobilize their nation's resource, that is, take their political will and start mobilizing that potential, and also who can better scale the production, the capabilities they need to sustain the fight, reconstitute their force over time. Now, Russia does look advantaged here, but we should also keep in mind that Ukraine is staying in this fight primarily because of its will, but also because of material assistance from the West, right? If it wasn't from the West, this war, frankly, would have been over quite some time ago. the West has overall a much greater advantage over Russia in capital, latent industrial capacity, and in technology. The countries involved in supporting Ukraine in this war, if you put them together, or if you just take the United States, actually don't put them together, just take the US alone, okay? Grossly overmatch Russia in these criteria. It is fundamentally an issue of political will. The problem we have in 2024 is that Ukraine mobilized first, Russia mobilized second in fall 2022, and the West did not sufficiently mobilize its resources because it did not appreciate what kind of war this was going to be, how long of a war we were going to be in, and what it would take in order to achieve these goals. And so we've lurched from one 6-month plan for an offensive to another 6-month plan for an offensive in this war. All right. And that's part of the issue of why we are where we are today, and why the choices made this year are going to be very significant in setting the trajectory of this war. Meaning, we are going to end up wherever we are in 2025 and 2026 because of the choices made this year, probably in the first half of this year, if anything.
I do want to raise, just for the audience as well, if you do have any questions or you would like answered, please feel free to send them through the Q&A function or the chat function. I want to turn back to a comment that Dr. Ben-Sahel that you had raised about the technological aspect of the battlefield that we're seeing today. And it builds off of Mr. Kaufman's remarks. The expectation about the nature and course and duration of the war, there was a great deal of fixation on what seemed to be red herring weapon systems. It was going to be the Javelin, the NLAW was going to be the solution, and then it was going to be the HIMARS, and then it was going to be the GIMLRs. And you go down this system of reasoning or logic when people like Mr. Kaufman were saying from the beginning, it's breaching tools, it's 155 artillery, it's very basic stuff. Do you still see a disconnect where we are today with the fixation on technology as opposed to the basics of what is needed on the battlefield? And at a macro level, have certainly the United States, but also European countries pivoted appropriately to provide what Ukraine needs in terms of that raw mass, if you will?
So from the range of technologies you just mentioned, it's very clear that Ukraine needs much more of the lower end stuff. There isn't a technological solution in terms of advanced conventional munitions that is nearly as important for this kind of, dug in attrition warfare on a fixed front than artillery, ammunition, those, there's just basic things. This is an infantry fight. You need those things that keep the infantry in the fight. That's more important for this kind of war that we've been in since 9 months into the war. As General Barno said, once you move from open warfare to a large-scale conventional conflict that has now become a dug-in stalemate. But I think that overlooks what I think of as the single most important bit of technology in these wars, and that's the role of drones. And I think, all of us, sitting there at the beginning of the war would have said that drones will be important, but I don't think, certainly, I couldn't have imagined the role that drones have played and how important they've become for basically almost every battlefield function. They served in the first months of the war when it was open fighting as an incredible intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance function, enabling ordinary Ukrainians to send geocoordinates of Russian targets in centrally, and then for the Ukrainian military to fan that out both to military units and citizens who had formed their own little squads of drone operations. They built their own drones and were operating them. So we saw that play a very important role early in the war, and now it's still the same. Even over the way in which drones are used are different now that we're in a dug-in war of attrition. But Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and Ukraine has scored naval victories over the Russian fleet using drones, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. The drones are still providing now, in addition to the intelligence function, armed munitions, armed drones are a huge part of how operations are unfolding. So, you started off by talking about the more advanced conventional systems, and I do think that those are not game changers anymore. They might have been, again, in an earlier phase of the war. Right now, the conventional tools that are most important are on that lower end, but also drones, right? And so you've got different levels of technology that are playing, from the lowest levels to some of the highest levels of technology that are both really important for how the war is unfolding.
Josh, I'd interject there too that what you're seeing, which is fascinating as an analyst, is the adaptation, counter-adaptation, counter-adaptation of these new technologies on the battlefield. So you've got, the Javelin, anti-tank guided missile system provided by the United States. It's going to be a tank killer. And the Russians have responded to that, and in part have responded to drones that are attacking tanks from above by having a design made to surround the tank with what are called colloquially cope cages, but they actually are now systemizing that. They're exporting that. All of their vehicles are now being equipped that way, and that creates a standoff between when the missile hits and being able to penetrate the armor. It hits the cage instead of hitting the tank. And so they've been able to get that fielded to protect most of their tanks and their self-propelled artillery in the last 6 or 8 months or so. And it's now a standard product because they've been able to do that decision loop, lessons learned loop back into their defense industry. They're using electronic warfare. They've always been very good at that, known for that during the Cold War. Their electronic warfare was designed for different targets, and it was deployed on the battlefield differently at the beginning of the war than it is today. It's very dispersed today, but it's being used now to interrupt drone feeds, to spoof GPS guided weapons such as the Excalibur 155 GPS guided artillery round. And so we're starting to see even these high-end Western technologies. Russians are coming up with adaptations that make them less effective or neutralize them on the battlefield, which, again, we in our minds knew that was going to happen, but actually seeing it happen in real time and having it such a rapid transition, it should be very sobering to all of us in the West to study Western military tactics.
Mr. Kaufman, if I can bring you in on that as well. We hosted Dr. Jack Watling from RUSI a few weeks ago, and he raised an interesting point in our conversations as he was asked about the seeming ubiquity of first-person drones. And his argument that he made was that it was a counter to offset what was a fundamental lack of 155 millimeter artillery shells, that it was a novel solution to an existing gap. Do you share that perspective? Is it, the technology is being integrated as we're seeing it live, or kind of what's your take on the focus on certainly FPV drones right now?
Look, it's a pretty complex topic. What I would say is, first, for folks who follow this online, I will obviously be very careful, just because you have to understand that the evidence being presented is always successful drone strikes. You never know what the effectiveness rate really is. They never show the drone strikes that fail, right? They always show the drone that hits the tank. They don't show the tanks that got hit by 6 drones and shrug those hits off. And they don't show how many drones are lost to electronic warfare and other things, and how much pilot skill is involved in actually operating drones, and what drones can't do. There are reasons for that. It's not just informational. It's because many of the drone units that employ these systems depend on crowdsourced fundraising, right? So they're actually also doing this in order to get more funding to get more drones. They have to. There's a lot of informal assistance going to them and going to Ukraine. So let me offer some thoughts. First, on technology, of course, I find more often than not, when militaries get into trouble, they hope the technology will get them out. Ironically, I find that whenever you're in a period of relative stalemate, they first try to improve the technology that got them there. So if drones are denying mobility, they first say, let's make those more capable and let's use more of those. I'm not sure that logic tracks, because it's a little bit like in World War I, somebody saying, if we build a better and more capable machine gun, maybe that'll get us out of the positional warfare that we're facing on the Western Front. But nonetheless, the way forward, to me, involves technology as part of the solution, but it should never be an alibi for addressing the fundamentals and problems in your force, right? If you can't employ your force at scale, then yes, drones are going to be very effective at stymieing any attack, because your biggest attack is going to be at the level of a company. Most attacks now in Ukraine at the front are assault groups around 11 to 16 men, right? And it's pretty easy to stop those attacks. 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 tanks attacking together, nothing more than that. And yeah, it's pretty easy to gang up on them with first-person view drones. Drones have made a significant impact on the battlefield, but keep in mind, they've not replaced any legacy 20th century system. They can offset requirements for artillery ammunition or anti-tank guided missiles in a number of cases. They substantially enhance the capability of artillery pieces in terms of accuracy and fire. They can take on certain missions better, like counter battery fire, right? And substantially reduce the amount of ammunition it takes to do that. They're much more effective on the defense when an opponent has to expose themselves in a mechanized assault than they are in the offense, because they are not a substitute for volume of fire artillery, and they have significant counters. Electronic warfare evolved along with drone systems in this war, right? The counters quickly developed with the advantages of offensive capabilities. It's proliferated. It's become small. Now there's trench electronic warfare systems mounted by troops along their trenches. Now there are small electronic warfare modules and armored fighting vehicles. So actually, yeah, drones are effective in some roles, but you see the counters to them rapidly develop. And a lot of folks who are involved in this in Ukraine refer to the battlefield as sort of electronic warfare jungle, okay? And keep in mind again, yes, drones are very effective as an offset, but I'm always wary of people getting too far down the rabbit hole of magical thinking and thinking that, hey, drones are going to replace artillery ammunition. Nobody in Ukraine or Russia has yet said we do not need field artillery anymore because now we have these drones and have had them for a year on the battlefield, right? And last point, it leads to really interesting effects. So first, drones displace a lot of your manpower towards drone support. Now you have an assault group going in, and it takes just as many people in drone support units to support that one assault group's attack as you have infantry on the ground. So it didn't reduce manpower necessarily that much, but it switched the manpower into a different role. The second is, while drones deny mobility on the battlefield, right, and people may think that in an age of a lot of drone combat, then maybe some of the traditional battlefield requirements are less important. It actually raised the issue of suitability and fitness for infantry, because now you have to walk to your forward positions quite a few kilometers, and you have to attack from that point because you can no longer count on the actual battlefield mobility. Now you got to drag and carry all your stuff with you. And when you take a position, you have to hold it for an entire day before you can expect resupply, because the enemy's drones are going to deny battle taxis and the other vehicles from being able to approach you. So it actually brings some of those requirements back to the fore rather than substantially reducing them for the force.
That's very, very insightful, and thank you very much for that. I do want to bring in two questions. I have several of my own. I can easily monopolize this conversation, but that'll be not so nice for the audience participation here. I've had two specifically on Ukraine, both very much similar. Is there a tactical scenario for Ukraine to concentrate long-range artillery fires on a land bridge or Crimea specifically to make it untenable for Russian operations without actually being there? And another one is very similar. From your perspective, is it operationally feasible to increase the pressure, certainly on the Kerch Strait bridge, excuse me, until the Russian military eventually withdraws? And do you see that as realistic for the Ukrainians? So I guess, where do we stand today with Crimea and Ukrainian pressure on Russian positions on Crimea? Okay, I want to open up to whoever wants to jump in first on those two. Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, I would just say we're on. The Kerch Bridge and that land bridge connection to Crimea, I think that's targetable. I don't think the Ukrainians have had success, obviously, in taking that out yet. There are weapon systems that have that capability at long range to destroy that. It can be repaired. So it's not a single point of failure all by itself that is the only way that Russian forces on Crimea are going to be able to sustain themselves. But it is a vulnerability. I would expect it's going to continue to be a focus of Ukrainian targeting. Whether they'll have access to weapons that the United States and other NATO countries have that could actually take that out decisively is unclear to me at this point.
Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Josh. It is very difficult to make the Russian positions in Crimea untenable unless Ukrainian forces can conduct a successful offensive and break through the south to the Sea of Azov, which is exactly what they were trying to do last year, and that is why they were trying to do it. And a strike campaign would have to be paired with an offensive operation. The deep battle and long-range precision strikes by itself are not a substitute for the close battle. This war has consistently shown that. You need both. You cannot establish fire control at range. Those big range rings that people paint around HIMARS systems, I'm sorry. Many of the fights in this war have taken place with both sides starting barely a few kilometers from each other and not changing those positions all that much, and struggling to establish fire control at 10 to 15 kilometers. You're not going to be able to do it at 50, 70, 100 plus. Regarding the bridge, collapsing the bridge would be difficult, but possible, I think. It would be a major problem for Russian sustainment, but it's not going to make Russian positions in Crimea by themselves untenable, nor is it going to lead to a collapse of the Russian force in the south. There's obviously an extensive land bridge that connects Russian forces along southern Ukraine to Crimea that without an offensive you cannot sever. Plus, you should be mindful of the fact that Russia annexed Crimea and seized it when? In 2014. But when was the bridge built? In 2018. And the rail part of the bridge was built and open in 2019, okay? So if your theory victory alone rests on the fact that the bridge, which was only built 4 years after Crimea was seized, is the only thing that Russia can use to resupply itself in Crimea, then history has some arguments against that proposition. It's going to take quite a bit more.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to bring into, and Dr. Ben-Sahel, the last part of the sort of three-legged stool of adaptation under fire is very much the leadership and personnel components of this. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on what you're seeing in terms of the adaptation, the innovation, and the prospects thereof from the battlefield, from the Ukrainian personnel into the Ukrainian apparatus. But then also with the point that was made earlier about the Russian lessons learned, the top-down aspect. So could you discuss the importance of personnel in adaptation and what you'd expect to see coming out of the counteroffensive last year into this year?
Well, I do think, as was said earlier, I think that the Ukrainians definitely have an advantage in bottom-up adaptation, right, to dealing with the most immediate tactical problems, because they have more of a sense of trust throughout their chain of command to allow experimentation, decentralization, innovative approaches when the battle allows it. Now, the problem is a stalemated, war of attrition doesn't allow for a lot of that. So that's not as much of a Ukrainian advantage today, but it certainly is. The Ukrainian ability to do that is certainly better than the Russian side, because the Russian adaptability, as has been said before, is so centralized, right? That's not uncommon in authoritarian countries, right? Where you don't want people at the lower tactical levels to be experimenting, because they might go off and do something that you don't want them as an authoritarian leader to do. So again, not surprising really on either side. As to the ins and outs of the various leaders, especially in the military, and how they've changed, I'll defer to Michael on that. He knows that far better than I do. But one of the things that I think, again, was said earlier, that Michael said earlier, but the will of the Ukrainian people to fight is still very high, considering everything that Ukraine has been through, considering the mounting losses in this stalemate. And so you have to also look at political leadership, and as well how the military leadership is messaging the population. And so from the broadest sense, when you look at leadership, I think that in addition to whatever is going on at the tactical and maybe operational levels, is one of the most important stories of this war. Without that, without the will to endure a very devastating war of attrition, Ukraine would have lost already by this point. The fact that they keep fighting really is a testament to their will. They can't do it without Western support, but Western support would get them nowhere if they didn't have that.
Josh, I'd add that one of the things I've been reading about is interesting is because in part of the expansion of the Ukrainian military, the number of really qualified, trained leaders continues to drop, and there's a very limited number of really talented company commanders, battalion commanders, brigade commanders in a force that needs a lot more than they currently have. The NATO training solution has been for training those people to put them in long courses, sometimes in Western Europe, that train them in NATO tactics, not how the Ukrainians fight. There's been interesting analysis that said that some of those training courses actually point them in the wrong direction. They can't integrate artillery into their training. They can't integrate UAVs into their training because of restrictions on the NATO training ranges and things that are peacetime problems in Western Europe. So that they're not really getting the kind of training and development they need to continue to grow that leadership cadre at particularly the small unit levels. The other interesting anecdote I was reading about is that because the senior leaders now, let's say mid-grade leaders, the lieutenant colonels and colonels, want to see the battlefield and be able to control what's going on out there because they don't have full confidence that they've got trained junior leaders, they're denying their ability to use smoke on the battlefield because it prevents the drones from being able to see what's going on down there to allow those mid-grade leaders to control the fight, which I found fascinating because that's such an important way to fight through fortified positions, that you want to be able to conceal your movements by putting smoke screens out there, and that's now interfering with the drone surveillance being used for command and control by leaders further back. So some really interesting dynamics at play, but the whole leadership dynamic here is problematic for the Ukrainians, because they've, you know, in some ways not dissimilar to the Russians, they are depleting their pool of trained, talented leaders, and they're going to be less and less able to rely on mission command and all the value that brings in when they have people that simply aren't trained for the task.
Mr. Kaufman, I could turn to you and sort of go one step above, so that battlefield command position. There was a great deal of discussion about the replacement of General Zaluzhny with General Syrskyi and the potential implications of what that means at a sort of political military level. I'm curious your thoughts on that, if it was being read into much more than it should have been, if it does represent something more significant in terms of the direction of the active defense strategy or the course of the war this year.
So I'll be frank, it's not clear what Syrskyi's appointment really is going to mean for the direction of the war. It doesn't change the challenge. It doesn't change the structural problems in the force that he has to deal with. In fact, he's inherited quite a few challenges from the previous military leadership, and one of those first was the deteriorating situation in Avdiivka. What I point more to, or at least I think is a better way to direct this conversation, is that in any war you're going to have civil issues. I'm very far from expert on those, but let me tell you, military strategy is political in nature, because your political leadership sets the objectives, and they can interfere in strategy. And boy, are they probably going to. And in Ukraine, it certainly does. And when political and military leadership has disagreements, political leadership, at the end of the day, tends to have supremacy in an authoritarian system and a democratic system too. Okay. And what I think we see here is in part the result of a long-running set of disagreements between military leadership under Zaluzhny and Zelensky, the president. And they really burst out into the open. We don't have to hypothesize about them. We saw them starting last November through December and January between the statements that they were making. And so I think that a change in military leadership was almost inevitable at that point. As for what Syrskyi is going to bring, he has replaced a lot of the senior military leadership already and has put a new team. And supposedly he's looking at commanders of other units and brigade commanders and what have you. But it's way too early to tell. I mean, literally too early to tell. This new team has only just taken their positions. And so far he has signaled that, like Noor and I have discussed, the branding of the strategy is active defense. The substance of the strategy appears to be incipient or emergent. Let's put it that way.
That's a very, very good point. One thing I would be remiss if we didn't discuss, which we've discussed in previous conversations, is very much what the United States military is learning from this, or what the United States military should be learning from this. Over the course of this conversation, this has gone by far too quickly. We've talked about everything from the role of traditional conventional munitions, the role of drones, the adaptation processes for doctrine, technology, and leadership. I'm curious if I could start with you, General Barno. What are your big takeaways now, 2 years after the war, as opposed to where we were, say, this time last year? And what are you keeping an eye on as we look to the rest of this year?
No, it's a big topic. Lots of different things to look at. One of the things I would caution our listeners to realize is that every service, every part of every service is going to find its own unique lessons to justify its service, its capability, its platform, its weapon system in Ukraine, and deny any other interpretation of what's actually happening out there. So there's lots of, in the United States military, of course, and others, lots of bureaucratic churn of what does this mean about air superiority? Does this reinforce the need for air superiority? Or does it suggest that air superiority has changed dramatically with the introduction of drones? And so there'll be a lot of basically bureaucratic log rolling, infighting, position building to defend the F-35 or defend the next Army's armored vehicles out there. But a couple things, I guess, that jump out at me. One bright spot in terms of the U.S. military learning from this campaign is the Chief of Staff of the Army announced about 2 weeks ago that he was canceling the service's future advanced reconnaissance aircraft, a helicopter designed for reconnaissance purposes that has, several $billions invested in, I think $20 billion at this point in time invested in it. that he simply said, from what we're seeing in Ukraine, that mission can be better performed by drones. We don't need a manned helicopter or crewed helicopter to be able to do that. And he took some of that money and put it into counter UAS, counter drone systems, because the Army is I think significantly behind in that, as is all the other services. That's one of the few indications I've seen so far that U.S. military is making some analyses, some shifts, and then putting some money in some new systems behind what we're seeing on the battlefield out there. There's also, we had mentioned earlier in the conversation briefly, I think by Dr. Bensell, the naval aspect of this. What should the Navy be learning about the fact that a third of the Black Sea fleet has been sunk by a country that does not have a Navy and is using essentially naval drones to sink Russian warships and Russian supply ships in and around Crimea, without having any surface combatants of their own that have got crews. The U.S. Navy needs to take that on board, because many of their platforms, I think, are equally vulnerable, whether they're in the littorals or not. So there's a lot that's going to continue to emerge there with this idea of adaptation, counter-adaptation is going to make arguments on both sides of some of these equations. But I think I hope the U.S. military takes a very, very sober look at this and begins to make some significant decisions to maybe shift away from legacy capabilities that are being increasingly vulnerable and more towards some of the proliferation of lower cost and capable systems that we're starting to see on the battlefield here in Ukraine.
Dr. Bensell?
Yeah, I was about to jump in on that. I think some of the lessons that we've talked about in our previous discussions have remained true and have only been more validated by experience, I think. So I mentioned earlier the transparency of the battlefield and the advantage that gives defenders. I think that, we've talked about that before. I think that's still true, and it's still extremely important, even though the war in Ukraine obviously is in a very different phase than it was, certainly from our first conversation, and even I think from the last time we talked about a year ago, if I recall correctly. So I think that's still extremely important. I think other things are changing though, and I mentioned drones before, but I think one of the most important ones that the U.S. military, all the services will have to think about, but none more so than the Air Force, is what does it mean now that we have an air littoral where warfare is conducted, right? It used to be that, there'd be helicopters at the lower levels of, air operations, and then there'd be a gap for a while, and then you get to big fancy jets, right, which the U.S. relies upon, extensively for its planned future conventional operations. Well, now there's a layer of drones in between those. That can mess with helicopters. I think that's one of the reasons why General George, the Army Chief of Staff, canceled that one. I don't think that's the last cancellation we're going to see, not just to free up money, but because of the operational risks, right? Drones can pose lethal threats to helicopters of all kinds. But again, how do you deal with that as a new place where warfare is occurring? That's a problem that all of the services have to think about, because drones are not limited to any one service, but it really poses some existential questions for the Air Force in ways that General Barno and I are starting to think about, and hopefully we'll be writing about. I think that's going to be a huge change, and something that is new that we've seen in the more recent parts of the war that we're going to have to be thinking about a lot.
We had another question. Oh, sorry, Mr. Kaufman.
I wasn't sure I was going to get a bite at that apple or not. Sorry.
Please, by all means, take a big bite.
It just, I was going to say, I agree with David Dora. The first take is always, whatever we're learning from the war, it has to validate what we're already doing and want to do. That's but I think my sure bull list would be first, maneuverists need to make peace with attrition and the fact that they're not going to impose any cognitive dilemmas on anyone. Second, that you really need a fire's advantage, which is what brings shock and suppression to the battlefield. Transparency leads to dispersal, and it's difficult to mask both on the offense and the defense. And it's accelerated that trend. I think that was an observed trend in warfare well before this war, but it's very visible specifically in this war. Precision remains a viable counter to mask, but it is not a substitute for it. And the null factor in this war is cheap precision that is employed in very high volumes and how to deal with that. It's not yet clear where that's going to go and how that's going to evolve. I think it's also important when we study this war that we understand what is causing the adaptations we observe, because I just came back from a conference symposium where I observed a tendency for us to romance the adaptations, what's happening, but without understanding the problem and without asking, is the adaptation something we want to study, or do we want to make sure we don't end up having that problem? For example, the fact that an entire corps artillery supports a company commander in an attack and it's delegated and he can employ it, that seems great. But you should also keep in mind that the reason that's happening is you have a relatively static battlefield where the highest unit of action is actually a company, and the only attack happening that day is that company. And that's why that company commander has an entire corps artillery supporting them, because there's nothing else happening that day, okay? And incidentally, he also has an entire corps level of artillery opposing him on the Russian side, because he will be the only company attacking that day as well. And those are all notable adaptations, but you want to make sure that you understand the problem, and you want to ask yourself, do you want to end up having to fight that way and then solving those issues? And lastly, I think we still struggle with seriously planning and discussing the long war. Most of our discourse on great power wars is oriented around the initial period of war and the operational warfighting problem around which we base our defense planning. Even though all the history of these wars consistently shows us that it's very difficult to deal an initial knockout blow, but the war is probably going to be a lot longer than we or they think it's going to be, right? And that's likely going to become a war with high levels of attrition. And we're going to need to talk about how we're going to reconstitute the force, how we're going to conduct defense industrial mobilization. And that to sustain the war, we're going to need a lot more systems that fall into the category of many but simple versus the few and complex, which is the ones that we really love to buy. Anyway, I'll close out on that.
If I could just jump in, all of the things that Michael, that you just mentioned are things that the US has incredible difficulty doing, right? We've known since the beginning of the war that the defense industrial base needs to be expanded. I don't think anybody understood before the Ukraine war how much that needed to happen. And I don't see us making tremendous strides towards solving that, because it is such a difficult problem given how much defense industry has shrunk in recent years and the amount of money you would need to spend to build that up over time. So, I think that, as I said, most of the things that you just mentioned are going to be extremely difficult for the US to do, even some of these things that we've known since the beginning of the war. And so, the British don't talk about lessons learned. They talk about lessons identified, which I think is a much better way to phrase it. We know some of the things already coming out of this war, what the US needs to do to prepare better. I mean, if you're having trouble sustaining and equipping a force in Ukraine with US ammunition and other types of support, you're sure going to need to do that in a major power conflict in the future, right? But sometimes it's just really hard for the US to figure out exactly how to do those things. And I think that all of the things that Michael just mentioned fall into that category.
If I could just, I have one sort of last question. Unfortunately, I think it's a very large question, so I do apologize for kind of throwing this hand grenade out there. I think it was General Barno, you had mentioned in the course of the conversation that the theory of victory for and in Ukraine. I'm curious what your thoughts are on what a viable theory of victory looks like. I know Mr. Kaufman, you and Mr. Lee talked about measuring force generation capacity as a measure of success for the counteroffensive last year, for example. General Barno, if you had a quick takeaway, what your thought of what a theory of victory would look like, and I would love Dr. Ben-Sahel and Mr. Kaufman's thoughts as sort of a last-minute big picture question.
Yeah, frankly, I don't see a theory of victory in the military sense. I think any victory is going to ultimately be a political settlement. It could break in either direction. Wars are won at the strategic level, not just at the tactical level. This war is not going to be won or lost based on trench fighting or city fighting or an offensive down at the brigade or even a division size level. It's going to be solved politically, especially now that it's gone on for 2 years. And this is an incredibly important political year. You got a U.S. presidential election in November that's going to have a big impact on what's next in Ukraine. Everyone in Ukraine knows that. And it could, tilt the balance towards the Russians having the upper hand in any kind of a negotiated settlement, or oppositely, towards the Ukrainians having more confidence in their ability to sustain this fight and, negotiate from a better position of strength. So that's a huge, aspect that's not even on the battlefield at all. It's not even in Europe. And I think it's going to have potentially a decisive effect on which direction that the war ultimately gets resolved in. But I think it will have to be a negotiated settlement of some sort. The two key people in that right now are Zelensky and Putin, and which one feels confident that they have the upper hand in whatever that settlement might be. And I think we're going to be enduring a battlefield stalemate without any breakthrough major battlefield success for the foreseeable future.
Let me briefly go next, and I'll leave it to Michael to wrap up. I think right now for the Ukrainians, the theory of victory is not losing. And that's a better outcome than it sounds, right? That to stay in this war long enough to be able to perhaps, if Ukraine does all the things that Michael talked about, which is a big if, and if Western assistance continues at the level that Ukraine needs, also a big if, especially given the presidential election and what one of the candidates in particular has said about that. If Ukraine can hang on for another year and a half on that stalemated battlefield and maybe make some progress if they make those changes, that's probably one of the best strategic outcomes that Ukraine could hope for right now, to get to some sort of negotiated settlement on better terms.
Mr. Kaufman.
Sure. So, I think if you're discussing theory of victory for Ukraine, it's attaining war termination on favorable terms and ensure that Ukraine retains sovereignty and economic viability. Ideally, also a second deal for Ukraine with some kind of security commitments from the West, so it knows that any agreement it makes with Russia is not just Ukraine signing up for a Russian rearmament period and a continuation of this war. And most importantly, avoid being forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, or relative weakness, where the peace or the ceasefire, however you choose to term it, is essentially codifying that Russia gets to impose its will on Ukraine at the end of the war, the victor's peace. How can you get there? If Ukraine is able to hold Russia at the peak of its defense spending this year, fight efficiently, attrit Russian forces and equipment, even if they're forced to retreat from battles like Avdiivka, you have to appreciate it is much easier to defend, as Nora, David, and I have been discussing. And Russian forces have the same challenge this year of overcoming a prepared defense that Ukraine did. In terms of force quality and capacity of force employment, they're not looking tremendously better, all right? If Ukraine is able to effectively hold and prevent Russia from achieving its minimal war aims this year, and Russia's not looking like it's in a good position to do that as it heads into 2025, Russian leadership actually faces a great deal of uncertainty. They also have significant limiting factors. They also have to balance a lot of things in their economy in order to sustain this war. Their negotiating position and the confidence they are projecting now will begin to dwindle significantly in 2025, while Western capacity, industrial output of artillery ammunition, of air defense interceptors, what have you, actually is going to go up significantly by 2025, right? Folks need to appreciate we actually look better a year from now than we do right now at this point in the war. So bottom line is that, yes, it is possible for Ukraine to effectively defend and place itself in a better position than it is now, right, in order to achieve war termination, if not on favorable terms, at least on terms that don't constitute defeat.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. My sincerest thanks to all three of you for joining us for another fantastic conversation on this one. Before I turn it to Representative Nye to close us out, I would like to make the announcement that next Friday on March 1st, we are hosting Rear Admiral Tim Woods, the Defense Attaché of the United Kingdom, and previously the Defense Attaché to Kyiv at CSPC. So an invitation will go out shortly for that. But thank you so much again for what was an absolutely fantastic conversation. Could easily have gone well into the next hour, but I'll turn it to Representative Nye to close us out officially.
Well, let me just echo Joshua's thanks, and thanks to Joshua as well for putting this together. Thank you all for joining us for another one in our series. As we stated at the outset, I'm sure we could have easily filled 2 hours, but in about an hour, you've given us a really tremendously valuable overview of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. We talked a little bit about politics, and we observed some important lessons. So I deeply appreciate the analysis of our speakers, and you're making yourselves available for our series, and we hope to have you back again soon. Thanks for all the great intellectual work you're all doing. Much appreciated. Thanks to our audience for being with us, and we'll see you all next time.